In front of the lawyer, my sister pushed a velvet box towards me, her voice cold as ice. "This is your share. Dad said a soldier only needs discipline, not money." Inside, there was only his old dog tag. All my sacrifice, worth just a piece of metal. But she didn't know that piece of metal held the secret that would burn her world to the ground. My name is Captain Willis Stern. I am 28 years old. The air in the private conference room at the Four Seasons Scottsdale was a sterile, refrigerated thing, thick with the cloying scent of Serafina's perfume. Something expensive and sharp, designed to announce its owner's arrival. It clung to the heavy drapes and the polished mahogany table, a stark contrast to the clean, dry desert air I had left outside. Beneath the perfumed silence, the low, incessant hum of the air conditioner felt less like a sound and more like a judgment. My Air Force service dress uniform, the dark blue wool pressed to a razor's edge, had been a source of immense pride in every other room I'd ever entered. Here, it felt like a costume. I sat with my back ramrod straight, a habit drilled into me at the academy, feeling my otherness in a sea of muted Armani and Brioni suits. My sister, Serafina, presided over the reading of our father's will, not like a grieving daughter, but like a CEO conducting a hostile takeover. At 35, she was a Wall Street titan. Her ambition honed into a weapon she wielded with effortless cruelty. Her gaze swept the room, assessing, calculating, before it finally landed on me. It wasn't a glance of familial recognition. It was the look one gives a piece of furniture that clashes with the decor. Her gaze then flicked over my uniform, lingering for a moment on the silver captain's bars on my shoulders. A low murmur, just loud enough for me to hear, escaped her perfectly painted lips. "Did you really wear that to this? You look like an extra in Top Gun." The lawyer beside her, a man whose suit probably cost more than my first car, offered a tight, conspiratorial smirk. It wasn't a joke, it was a dismissal, a jab of a knife, twisting in the softest part of my pride. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes fixed on the water glass in front of me, watching the condensation trace a slow path down its side. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, began to read in a monotone drone, his voice weaving through the complex tapestry of legal jargon. He spoke of trusts, of stocks, of properties in New York and Connecticut. It all flowed in one direction. The bulk of the Stern estate, its holdings, properties, and trusts, were to be administered by and bequeathed to the sole executor, Serafina Thorne. He was about to read my full name, Williamina Stern, when a single manicured hand rose from the head of the table. Serafina cut him off without a word. She stood, a predator in a tailored suit, her movements economical and imbued with absolute power. She picked up a small black velvet box from the table in front of her. For a moment, my heart stuttered with a foolish, childish hope. Maybe there was something personal, something meaningful. She walked the length of the table until she stood before me. She didn't hand it to me. She pushed it across the polished mahogany, the soft velvet whispering against the wood until it stopped inches from my hands. Her voice was as cool and dry as the Arizona desert air outside. "This is your share." I looked up from the box to meet her gaze. Her eyes were chips of ice, devoid of anything but triumph. "Dad said a soldier only needs discipline, not money." The sentence was not a quote. It was a weaponized interpretation, a public execution of my worth delivered in front of a paid audience. The lawyer looked down at his papers, suddenly fascinated by a non-existent speck of dust. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a roaring, crushing weight that pressed down on my shoulders, trying to force them to slump. It sank into my chest, trying to steal the air from my lungs. It was the sound of absolute humiliation. My hand, I noticed, with a detached sort of curiosity, had a slight tremor as I reached for the box. The velvet was cold to the touch. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn, dark lining, was a single object, a military dog tag, its silver edges dulled by time and wear. Next to it lay a small, faded photograph of our father in his youth, standing proudly beside his F-4 Phantom in Vietnam. Tucked beneath it was a small folded piece of paper with his familiar looping handwriting. My breath caught in my throat, the sleepless nights in the dust-choked air of Bagram, the gut-wrenching tension of flying a C-17 through contested airspace, my hands steady on the yoke while my heart hammered against my ribs, the faces of the soldiers I'd carried home, draped in the flag. The years of discipline, the sacrifice, the unwavering commitment to a cause greater than myself. All of it, valued at the price of a memento. I didn't cry, I didn't scream or protest. The training runs too deep. I simply raised my head and looked directly into Serafina's victorious eyes. The shock wasn't about the money. I had never expected it. It was the final brutal confirmation of a truth I had spent my entire life trying to deny. That in their world, the world of power and finance and inherited prestige, I was and always would be an outsider, a supporting role, an extra. My fingers closed around the dog tag in the box. I didn't lift it out, I just squeezed, letting the cold, sharp edges of the metal bite into the soft flesh of my palm. The small, sharp pain was a welcome anchor in the swirling vortex of shock and grief. It was real. When? My mind whispered, the question forming from the deepest, most wounded part of my soul. When did this disregard begin? The question hung in the refrigerated air of the conference room, a silent echo long after Serafina and her lawyer had departed. When? When did this disregard begin? The cold, sharp edges of my father's dog tag, still pressed into my palm, seemed to answer. The chill of the metal was a conduit, pulling me back through time, away from the sterile luxury of the Arizona resort, and into the suffocating warmth of a memory. It was Thanksgiving, the year I turned 17. Our sprawling Connecticut home was filled with the rich, savory smell of roast turkey and spiced wine, the low murmur of the football game on TV, a familiar backdrop to the holiday chatter. I was buzzing with a joy so pure it felt like electricity under my skin. In my hand, I clutched the thick, formal envelope that had arrived that morning, my acceptance letter to the United States Air Force Academy, with a full scholarship. It was everything I had worked for, a future I had carved out for myself, a promise to serve. I found my father by the fireplace, a glass of red wine in his hand. I could barely contain my excitement as I showed him the letter, the official seal of the academy gleaming under the lamplight. He scanned the first paragraph and gave my shoulder a brief, perfunctory pat. "That's good, Willa, very good." And then his attention was gone. He turned away, his eyes lighting up as he saw my sister. Serafina had just breezed in, home for the holiday from her first semester at Wharton, radiating an aura of sophisticated confidence. "There she is!" Dad boomed, his voice full of a pride that was visceral, unrestrained. He pulled her into a one-armed hug. "Tell me again about that market analysis paper. Davies said your professor thinks you have a real killer instinct." The rest of the evening became a symphony of praise for my sister. The conversation orbited around her, her classes, her brilliant grasp of financial models. the future she was mapping out on a path paved with gold. My father, his voice animated, recounted her insights to our uncles and cousins. My mother beamed, refilling Serafina's glass, hanging on her every word. I sat on the edge of the sofa, the crisp acceptance letter feeling flimsy and insignificant in my hands. My achievement, a commitment to my country, was a discordant note in this grand orchestra, celebrating my sister's future financial triumphs. The sounds of laughter and clinking glasses faded into a dull roar. In a house full of my own family, surrounded by the people who were supposed to be my greatest champions, I had never felt so profoundly, utterly alone. I was invisible, my life's biggest moment, dissolving into the background noise of their admiration for her. The chill of that memory bled into another, sharper and more painful. The vast sun-drenched field of the Air Force Academy, 4 years later, graduation day. It was a day of magnificent ceremony. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A sea of cadets in dress uniform sat in perfect formation, a testament to 4 years of relentless discipline. The stands were packed with thousands of proud families, their cheers and applause echoing across the grounds. I stood at attention, the fabric of my own uniform crisp and new, my heart swelling with a fierce, soaring pride, as the F-16 Thunderbird screamed overhead in a flawless diamond formation. We had made it. I had made it. But as I scanned the section of seats designated for the Stern family, all I saw was a block of empty, sun-bleached aluminum. They weren't there. The call had come the night before. It was my mother, her voice rushed and strained. "Oh, honey, we are so proud of you, but we just can't make it tomorrow," she'd said, the sound of clattering dishes in the background. Serafina was just promoted to vice president at Goldman Sachs, and we're in the middle of planning a huge celebration party for her this weekend. The caterers, the guest list, it's just chaos here. My father got on the line. "We'll make it up to you, Willa, we promise." But they never did. That promise, like so many others, evaporated into thin air. It was the moment I finally understood the unspoken hierarchy of my family. My sister's success, measured in titles and bonuses, was always the main event. My service, measured in sacrifice and duty, was merely a footnote. The roar of the F-16s faded, replaced by the hushed, powerful hum of the Gulfstream's engines. The memories dissolved, pulling me back to the suffocating present. I was in the air again, but this time in a cage of plush leather and polished wood, flying back to New York. Serafina sat opposite me, legs crossed, sipping a glass of champagne. The same look of smug satisfaction she'd worn in the lawyer's office was still etched on her face. She held all the cards she had won. Looking at her, I suddenly saw it all with a blinding, painful clarity. This wasn't a single incident. It was a system, a structure, carefully built and reinforced over my entire life. The dismissals, the forgotten milestones, the blatant favoritism, they were all bricks in a wall, built to keep me on the outside. I had spent my entire youth fighting for an approval that was never on the table, striving for a recognition that had never existed for me. My hand tightened around the dog tag in my pocket. The sharp edge bit into my skin again, but this time the pain felt different. It wasn't the sting of humiliation. It was the spark of something new, something hard and unyielding. The past was written, but the story of today, I would write myself. The chartered flight, Aura Air 718, sliced through the inky blackness of the night sky, a silver needle stitching a path from Arizona to New York. Inside the cocoon of luxury, the silence was a fragile thing, stretched taut between my sister and me. Serafina swirled the pale gold Sauvignon Blanc in her glass, the crystal reflecting the soft cabin lights. She had been watching me, her eyes narrowed with a predatory focus. After taking a delicate sip, she finally launched her attack. "Still playing soldier, Willa?" she began, her tone dripping with condescension. "Still running away from the real world?" I said nothing. My gaze remained fixed on the window, on the ghostly shapes of clouds drifting past thousands of feet below. I had learned long ago that engaging with her was like wrestling in mud. You both get dirty, but only she enjoys it. My silence only seemed to fuel her. "Did you know," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that you were written out of the will years ago?" The words were a delayed action bomb. They hung in the air for a second before detonating in my mind. I turned from the window, my body going rigid. I stared at her, my expression blank with shock. She laughed. It was not a sound of mirth, but a cold, metallic clinking. "Don't look at me like that. I was protecting you from yourself." She leaned forward, the very picture of feigned concern. Someone who has nightmares about the war. How could they possibly manage a diverse investment portfolio? Ice flowed through my veins, a paralyzing cold that started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. My blood ran thick and slow. She explained it with the calm, methodical precision of someone presenting a business plan, laying out the steps of my own destruction. She had used her power, her money, her connections. She'd gotten her hands on my military service record, a file that should have been protected, private. And she had found what she was looking for. The mandatory psychological evaluation I underwent after my last tour in Afghanistan. It was a standard procedure, a safety net designed to protect soldiers, to help us process the things we'd seen and done. It was a sign that the Air Force cared, but in Serafina's hands, care became a weapon. She'd taken that file to the family lawyers. She had twisted the clinical language, the confidential sessions, the very act of seeking support into a damning indictment. She painted a picture of me as psychologically unstable, as suffering from severe PTSD, and therefore unfit to manage financial assets. It was the most brilliant and most heinous move I could imagine. A perfectly calculated strike aimed not at my wallet, but at the very heart of my honor, my service, and my sacrifice. She had taken the invisible wounds of war, the price of my duty, and put a dollar sign on them, and the value was zero. In the moment, I fully grasped the monstrous depth of her betrayal. The entire aircraft shuddered violently. A deafening bang erupted from the right side of the plane, a sound like metal tearing itself apart. The serene cabin lights flickered wildly, then died, plunging us into a disorienting darkness, pierced only by the faint emergency strips along the floor. A sharp, acrid smell of burning chemicals and electrical wiring filled the air. Serafina screamed, a high, panicked shriek, as her wine glass shattered on the floor. The other passengers, a handful of her corporate associates, began to cry out in alarm. But amidst the rising panic, something inside me shifted. The white-hot rage that had been building in my chest suddenly went cold, crystallizing into a razor-sharp focus. The weight of the dog tag in my pocket felt different now, not like a memento of dismissal, but like a piece of ballast grounding me. Then a second explosion, louder and more violent than the first, ripped through the air. The plane lurched, dropping altitude with a sickening heave. Yellow oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling, dangling like grotesque fruit. The screams intensified, but I was no longer listening. In that cacophony of terror, I was no longer Willa Stern, the wounded sister, the family outcast. I was Captain Stern, United States Air Force. I unbuckled my seatbelt in one fluid motion. I was on my feet, my body moving on pure, unadulterated instinct. The years of training, the endless drills, the emergency protocols burned into my brain, all took over. I launched myself toward the cockpit. I burst through the cockpit door and into the heart of a technological nightmare. The immediate assault on my senses was overwhelming. A cacophony of alarms blared in a dissonant chorus. The high-pitched shriek of the stall warning, the insistent bell of the engine fire alert, the deep thrum of the master caution, all screaming for attention in a language of pure emergency. The entire space was bathed in an apocalyptic red glow from the flashing lights on the main instrument panel, painting every surface in pulsing shades of crisis. Slumped forward over the center console, completely still, was the captain, unconscious. His ornate gold-striped hat had fallen to the floor. The first officer, a young man whose name tag read Elias Vance, was locked in a desperate losing battle with the aircraft itself. His face, normally a healthy olive tone, was ashen, the color of old paper. His knuckles were bone white as he wrestled with the yoke, his arms trembling from the strain of fighting a dying machine. The massive Boeing 777 was no longer a graceful marvel of engineering. It was a wounded beast, shuddering and bucking violently, plunging through the turbulent night sky. In that singular, chaotic moment, a voice from my past cut through the noise. It was my flight instructor at the academy, a grizzled old colonel with eyes that had seen it all. His words echoed in my head with the force of a command. When hell opens up beneath you, Captain, you don't rise to the occasion. You sink to the level of your training. And just like that, a switch flipped deep inside me. The world narrowed. The white-hot anger at Serafina, the sting of a lifetime of disregard, the crushing humiliation, it all atomized, vanishing like smoke. All that remained were the cold, hard mechanics of survival. The procedures, the checklists, the rote responses, drilled into my very soul by thousands of hours in simulators and in the sky. Get back! My voice sliced through the alarms, sharp and devoid of hesitation. It was the command voice, the one I'd been trained to use when lives were on the line. Elias Vance flinched as if struck, his head whipping around. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was paralyzing him. But something in my tone, the absolute unwavering certainty, acted as a defibrillator to his panic-stricken mind. He relinquished his death grip on the yoke and scrambled out of the captain's seat, his movements clumsy with adrenaline. I slid into the vacated chair, my body moving with an instinctual efficiency. My right hand snapped the headset over my ears, tuning out the cabin noise, while my left hand took the yoke, feeling the terrifying grinding vibrations of a failing aircraft shuddering up through the control column. My eyes, trained for this exact scenario, swept across the panel, a maelstrom of red and amber lights. My brain processed the data with cold, machine-like speed. Engine 2 was gone, engulfed in flames. Hydraulic pressure was dropping like a stone. We were falling and falling fast. I keyed the microphone. The voice that came out was not my own. It was the voice of a pilot in command, calm, stripped of all emotion, professional. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Aura Air 718, heavy. We have an uncontained engine failure. Engine number 2 is on fire. We have a critical loss of hydraulics and an incapacitated captain on the flight deck. requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport for an emergency landing. The transmission was a line of pure logic drawn through the chaos. And in the momentary quiet that followed, another voice, shrill, ragged, and hysterical, ripped through the cockpit door from the cabin. It was Serafina. "She has PTSD. I told you, she's mentally unstable. She's hijacking the plane. Get her out of there." The words were so monstrous, so disconnected from our reality, that for a split second my focus wavered. She was trying to kill us. In the middle of a disaster she couldn't comprehend. Her only instinct was to destroy me, even if it meant taking everyone else down with her. A flight attendant's terrified face appeared in the doorway, caught between Serafina's shrieks and the unfolding horror. Before I could even formulate a response, Elias acted. He surged to his feet and physically blocked the entrance, his lanky frame transforming into a defiant barrier. "Everyone sit down and shut up," he roared, his voice cracking but infused with newfound authority. "Do you understand me? Without her, we are all dead. Now sit down and buckle up." He slammed the cockpit door shut, the sound a definitive punctuation mark. He turned back to me, and the look in his eyes had been forged anew in the crucible of this crisis. The shock and doubt were gone, replaced by a raw, absolute trust. He no longer saw a woman in a uniform. He saw a pilot, his pilot. He saw his only chance. A calm, steady voice, a gift from God, crackled through the headset from air traffic control. "Aura 718, copy your Mayday. We read you. Turn left, heading 290. The nearest airport is Prairie View Municipal, Nebraska. I can get you runway 31. Descend and maintain 10,000 feet. Prairie View Municipal, Nebraska." The name landed in the cockpit like a ton of bricks, a municipal airport. I stared at the dark horizon ahead, my mind racing. I glanced at Elias. His eyes met mine, and the same grim, terrifying understanding passed between us without a single word. Prairie View wouldn't have a 12,000-foot runway of reinforced concrete, designed for the weight and speed of a wide-body jet. It would have a short, narrow strip of asphalt, maybe 5,000 feet if we were lucky, meant for crop dusters and six-seater Cessna planes. We were being asked to land a wounded 200-ton iron bird on a runway that was little more than a postage stamp in the vast, unforgiving darkness. It wasn't a challenge. It was a mathematical impossibility. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my hands firm on the controls. The aircraft groaned around us, a dying behemoth. "All right, Elias," I said, my voice a flat line, betraying nothing of the cold dread coiling in my gut. "Let's go to work." Getting the crippled 777 over the plains of Nebraska was a small miracle of physics and stubbornness, but landing it was another matter entirely. It was a mathematical impossibility we were about to attempt. Through a break in the clouds, the runway at Prairie View Municipal finally appeared. It wasn't a runway, it was a ribbon, a short, narrow strip of black asphalt surrounded by an ocean of dark, empty farmland. It looked impossibly small, a toy meant for a child's model airplane. Our airspeed was still terrifyingly high. The flaps were only partially deployed due to the hydraulic failure, meaning we couldn't slow down to a safe landing speed. We were coming in too hot, too fast, and too heavy. And then the voice started, a synthetic, emotionless computer voice that filled the cockpit, a sound designed by engineers to inject pure, primal fear into the heart of any pilot. The ground proximity warning system. Terrain, terrain. It was a cold, robotic statement of fact. We were too low and too fast. My hands tightened on the yoke, feeling the dying beast shudder beneath my control. Pull up, pull up. The voice became a command, an absolute order, hardwired into every pilot's brain. It screamed at me to climb, to fight for altitude. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that if I pulled up, we were dead. Our one remaining engine was already strained to its limit. If I demanded more power, we'd stall, lose all control, and drop out of the sky like a stone. I had to ignore it. I had to fly the plane. I held our descent steady, my eyes locked on the approaching runway lights, a fragile constellation in the darkness. The synthetic voice continued its relentless assault, a chorus of doom chanting in my ears. Terrain, pull up. Beside me, Elias sat rigid, his hands clamped onto the armrests of his seat, his forehead beaded with sweat that gleamed in the flashing red light of the cockpit. He didn't speak. He didn't question me. His eyes were fixed on my face, his trust a tangible, heavy thing in the air between us. He had ceded control completely. These lives were now in my hands. This wasn't a commercial airliner anymore. This was a military problem. And military problems required unconventional solutions. "Get ready," I said to Elias. My voice was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the screaming alarms. "When I give the command, I need you to cut all power, everything." He stared at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Cut all power. "All of it," I confirmed. "We're not flying an airliner anymore, Elias. We're flying a 200-ton glider. We don't need lift, we need drag. We need to fall out of the sky with style." It was a move that went against every page in the Civilian Aviation Handbook. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble. He nodded, a single sharp jerk of his head. He understood. We were a few hundred feet from the runway now. The world outside was a terrifying blur of motion. The runway lights were rushing at us. The voice was screaming, "Terrain, pull up, sink rate, pull up." My heart felt like it had stopped beating. My entire world had shrunk to this single critical moment. It was now or never. "Now," I yelled, my voice a raw, primal sound. Elias's hand shot out and slammed the throttle levers back to idle cutoff. The last engine died with a final, mournful whine. For a sickening half-second, the massive plane felt weightless. Then it began to fall, a true, terrifying plummet. I pulled back hard on the yoke, fighting to keep the nose up, trying to flare, trying to glide the behemoth onto the asphalt. The only sounds in the cockpit now were the howling of the wind, rushing past the fuselage, and the incessant shrieking alarm. The impact was a cataclysmic shock that jolted every bone in my body. The main landing gear slammed onto the runway with a deafening bang. The 707 bounced once, a horrifying skip, before the tail crashed down hard against the concrete. The sound of tearing metal was a physical scream, a grinding, shrieking protest from the battered airframe. The tires screeched, burning rubber and smoke filling the air as I and Elias stomped on the brake pedals with all our strength. I activated the thrust reversers on our one dead engine, a futile but necessary gesture to gain every last ounce of drag. The plane skidded, fishtailing violently down the short runway, a runaway train of metal and fire. We were running out of asphalt. Ahead of us, a vast, dark field of corn loomed. The plane veered off the tarmac, plowing through the dirt and mud, tearing up the earth as it hurtled toward a barbed wire fence at the edge of the field. Just feet from the fence line, with a final shuddering groan, it stopped. The sudden silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, so profound it was almost unbearable. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my heart against my ribs. And then, a new sound began. From the cabin behind us, a single person started to clap, then another and another. Within seconds, the sound grew into a symphony of life, a wave of applause, of relieved sobs, of joyous shouts, of people crying out the names of their loved ones and the name of God. We were alive. We were on the ground. We were alive. The symphony of life, from the passenger cabin, the cheers, the applause, the relieved sobs, lasted only a few precious moments. It was soon drowned out by a different kind of sound, one that signaled the end of one crisis and the beginning of another. The approaching sirens of fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars, their wails cutting through the Nebraska night. I was not welcomed on the ground as a hero. I was met as a liability. The media storm hit before the wreckage had even cooled. I was whisked away by FAA officials, not to be debriefed as a pilot, but to be quarantined as a person of interest. From the sterile confines of a cheap motel room on the outskirts of Prairie View, I watched the narrative of my actions being twisted into a caricature of incompetence and instability. The headlines screamed from every cable news channel and website. Reckless Air Force pilots' dangerous gamble on civilian flight. And more insidiously, questions mount over hero pilot's mental state. Somehow, a cell phone video had been leaked. It was a grainy, chaotic clip of Serafina, her face contorted in what the media portrayed as terrified concern, screaming about my PTSD to the flight attendants. The video went viral. It had the dual effect of making my sister look like a villain to much of the country, but it also successfully planted the poisonous seed she intended, doubt. Was Captain Stern truly a hero, or was she a mentally unstable veteran who got lucky? Serafina's plan, which had failed so spectacularly at 35,000 feet, was now succeeding with ruthless efficiency on the ground. I was isolated, grounded pending investigation, hundreds of miles from my base, my squadron, my support system. I was utterly alone. The official hearing with the NTSB and the FAA was even worse. I sat at a long, polished table in a soulless government building, facing a panel of men with impassive, bureaucratic faces. They didn't look at me like the person who had saved a plane full of people. They looked at me like a problem, a loose wire in their neat and orderly system. A senior investigator, a man named Harris with tired eyes and a cheap tie, leaned into his microphone. It was clear from his first question that Serafina's high-priced lawyers had already been whispering in his ear. "Captain Stern," he began, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, "is it correct that you have a documented history of receiving psychological treatment for combat-related stress?" The question hung in the air, clinical and cold. He wasn't asking for information. He was laying the foundation for a verdict. "My service record is confidential," I replied, my own voice just as level. He pressed on, ignoring my deflection. "Captain, based on this history, we need to understand your decision-making process. Was your choice to completely cut power to a still-functioning engine a decision that goes against all commercial aviation protocols, an impulsive act rather than a sound, professional judgment?" I felt a slow, hot anger building in my chest. They were trying to pathologize my competence. They were attempting to reframe my greatest act of professional skill as a symptom of a disease. To turn my training into madness. I leaned forward, met his gaze without blinking, and let a sliver of the ice I'd held back for so long enter my voice. I saved 288 lives, including my own. It was the most professional decision of my life. That night, back in the suffocating silence of the motel room with its stained carpet and flickering fluorescent lights, I felt the exhaustion settle deep into my bones. It felt like I was on the verge of collapsing. I had stared down death in the sky and won, only to find myself losing a war of whispers and lies on the ground. The system I had sworn to serve, the very country I had pledged my life to, felt like it was closing in on me. Aimlessly, I flipped through the channels on the small television. I stopped on a late-night broadcast of a commencement speech. The face on the screen was instantly recognizable. Admiral William H. McRaven. It was his famous Make Your Bed speech from the University of Texas. His voice, calm and steady, filled the lonely room. "If you want to change the world," he said, "start off by making your bed. If you make your bed every morning, you will have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride, and it will encourage you to do another task and another and another." The words were simple, practical. It was an idea rooted in the discipline I knew, the order I craved in the midst of this chaos. And I wonder if you, listening to this right now, have ever had a moment like that? A moment when the entire world feels like it's spinning out of control, and all you can do is focus on one small, simple thing to keep yourself from falling apart. That's what it was for me. I couldn't control the NTSB. I couldn't control the press. I couldn't control my sister's lies. But I could control the space within these four walls. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The first thing I did was make my bed. I pulled the thin blanket taut. I folded the corners into perfect 45-degree angles. I smoothed out every wrinkle until the surface was as flat and orderly as a parade ground. It was a small thing, a ridiculously small thing, but as I stood back and looked at it, a tiny sliver of pride cut through the fog of my despair. It was an accomplishment, it was mine, and it was a start. The war wasn't over, it had just begun. The simple act of making my bed each morning became a catalyst. The small sense of control it gave me radiated outward, transforming my passive despair into focused action. I was no longer a victim awaiting judgment. I was an intelligence officer on a mission. My new field of operations was a dusty corner of Nebraska. My first move was to purchase a cheap, untraceable burner laptop from a pawn shop in Omaha. My second was to find a generic coffee shop with public Wi-Fi, the kind of place with mediocre coffee and transient customers that ensured anonymity. I sat in a booth at the back, the laptop screen angled away from prying eyes, and began to dig. The words from my father's note, the one that came with the dog tag, kept echoing in my mind. "I've always admired your discipline, Willa." At first, I had dismissed it as another one of his backhanded compliments, a hollow platitude. But now it felt different. It wasn't a comfort, it was a clue, a directive. What was discipline? It was attention to detail. It was the belief that nothing is ever truly random. I pulled the dog tag from my pocket. It felt heavy, substantial in my hand. In the dim light of the coffee shop, I examined it again. It looked ordinary, just like the thousands I had seen before. But my training had taught me to look past the obvious, to question the surface. I turned it over and over, feeling its weight, its texture, the worn smoothness of the edges. I ran my thumb along the bottom edge, a slow, methodical sweep. And then I felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible line. It wasn't a dent or a random scratch from wear and tear. It was a perfect, hair-thin seam. My heart began to beat a little faster. My senses sharpened. I pulled out my Leatherman multi-tool, another piece of standard-issue gear that had been with me for years. Using the tip of the smallest flathead driver, I carefully worked at the tiny seam. I applied steady, gentle pressure. There was a faint click, and a thin metal plate, no thicker than a fingernail, separated from the main body of the tag. It wasn't a standard dog tag. It had been hollowed out, customized with a hidden compartment. My breath hitched. Inside, nestled in a tiny cutout, was a single micro SD card, carefully wrapped in a small piece of anti-static plastic. My mind raced. What was this? Some final cruel joke from a man who reveled in misdirection? Or was it something more? Something he couldn't entrust to anyone else? My hands were trembling slightly as I retrieved the card. I slid it into the reader I'd bought with the laptop and plugged it in. A single encrypted file appeared on the screen, protected by a password prompt. My mind went to the obvious. I typed my own birthday. Access denied. I tried Serafina's. Access denied. Our mother's, my father's. The date of their anniversary. Nothing. Every attempt was met with the same cold, digital rejection. I sat back, staring at the blinking cursor, frustration mounting. It felt like I was at the edge of a great discovery, but the final door was locked. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. Discipline, attention to detail. I thought about the other item in the box, the faded photograph of my father standing beside his F-4 Phantom. The plane, it had to be the plane. I opened a new browser tab and began my search. F-4 Phantom Squadrons, Vietnam War. The search returned hundreds of results. It was a needle in a digital haystack. For hours I sat there, nursing a single cup of coffee, cross-referencing squadrons, deployment dates, and bases, diving deep into the military archives. And then finally I found it. His name, Alistair Stern, was on a roster for a tactical fighter squadron based out of Da Nang. Their call sign, their nickname, was painted on the nose of their jets, the Night Owls. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The password, it had to be. I typed it in, replacing the I with a 1 and the O with a 0. A common practice for old-school passwords. N1GHTs I hit enter, the file unlocked, and the contents that spilled onto my screen were a treasure trove of pure, unadulterated fraud. It was all there, a meticulously organized archive of a secret life. Scanned bank statements from shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. Investment contracts with forged signatures, and a string of emails between my father and Serafina, coolly discussing the creation of a front company called Apex Fiduciary Services to quietly funnel money offshore and handle my father's massive hidden gambling debts. The Stern empire wasn't built on my father's legendary business acumen. It was a house of cards built on a sophisticated system of lies, forgeries, and financial crimes. Serafina wasn't just the heir, she was an active accomplice. I leaned back in the sticky vinyl booth, the lukewarm coffee completely forgotten. My father hadn't left me a memento. He had left me a weapon, a key to either destroy his legacy or to finally save my own. I closed the laptop, a cold, hard certainty settling over me. I knew what I had to do next. I pulled out my phone, searched for top litigators in New York, and made the first call. The boardroom of Thorn Capital was a temple of modern power, all glass and steel overlooking the concrete canyons of Manhattan. I walked in, my posture straight, my gaze level. My lawyer, a formidable former federal prosecutor named Marcus Thorne, no relation, a fact he found grimly amusing, followed a step behind me. Serafina was already holding court. She sat at the head of the massive granite table, the very picture of confidence and control. The members of her board, a collection of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits, were arranged around her, their expressions a mixture of concern and skepticism. They were listening to the final act of her performance. And therefore, for the protection of this company's reputation and the preservation of our family's legacy, Serafina was saying, her voice resonating with false gravity, it is the board's fiduciary duty to sever all ties. We simply cannot allow an individual with a documented history of psychological instability to have any claim or influence over the Stern estate. She concluded her speech, her eyes flicking towards me with a look of cold, clinical pity. It was a masterful performance. She had painted me as a liability, a broken soldier who needed to be gently but firmly pushed aside for her own good. The room was silent. All eyes turned to me. Marcus cleared his throat. He smiled, a thin, dangerous smile that I imagined he had perfected in countless courtrooms. "Thank you for that presentation, Ms. Thorne," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Now, if you'll direct your attention to the screen, we have a short presentation of our own." He clicked a button on a remote. The large screen behind Serafina, which had just been displaying financial projections, flickered to life. But there were no graphs or charts, only a single audio file, its sound wave pulsing silently. Marcus pressed play. The sound of a jet engine's hum filled the room, followed by my sister's unmistakable voice, dripping with condescension. "Still playing soldier, Willa? Still running away from the real world?" The secret recording from the flight continued, culminating in her chilling admission. "I was protecting you, someone who has nightmares about the war. How could they possibly manage a diverse investment portfolio?" A ripple of shock went through the boardroom. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Serafina's confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. This was an unexpected diversion. "This is an illegal recording," she snapped. "Inadmissible." "We'll let the authorities be the judge of that," Marcus said calmly, clicking to the next slide. The screen was now filled with a scanned document. It was a bank statement for a company called Apex Fiduciary Services, registered in the Cayman Islands. The balance showed millions of dollars. The faces around the table grew tense. Next, an email chain appeared. The correspondents, Alistair Stern and Serafina Thorne. The subject, handling the Vegas problem. The contents detailed a plan to discreetly move funds through Apex to cover our father's massive, undeclared gambling debts. Serafina's face had begun to lose its color. This is taken out of context." The next slide showed a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the signature of a notary public on the Stern family trust documents, the very documents that disinherited me. On the right was the notary's official, verified signature from his state registration. They were clearly different. Marcus's voice was cold and precise. "Our forensic expert confirmed this signature is a forgery, which is particularly impressive given that the notary in question, Mr. Albert Finney, passed away 5 years before this document was allegedly signed and stamped by him." The air in the room became thick, heavy, and unbreathable. The carefully constructed facade of the Stern Empire was cracking, revealing the rotten core beneath. Serafina's composure finally shattered. She shot to her feet, her face a mask of pale, panicked fury. This is stolen information. It's slander. It's illegal," she stammered, her voice rising in pitch. "You can't use this." Marcus Thorne looked at her, and his smile was gone, replaced by the grim finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "On the contrary, Ms. Thorne," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal tone. "This is the true legacy of the Stern family, and a complete copy of it, along with a sworn affidavit from my client, was delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and the New York field office of the FBI exactly 10 minutes ago. The last word, FBI, landed in the silent room like a death knell. Serafina collapsed back into her chair as if her bones had turned to dust. The mask of power, the Armani armor, the Wall Street Queen persona, it all disintegrated in an instant, leaving behind a desperate, terrified woman who had been caught. The game was over. She had lost. I stood up. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the length of the long table until I stood directly in front of her. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her gaze was fixed on the granite tabletop, her world shrinking to that single point. I reached into my pocket and took out my father's dog tag. I placed it gently on the table, right in her line of sight. The small piece of metal made a soft, definitive sound against the stone. She flinched. "Discipline," I said, my voice quiet but clear and steady enough to carry through the silent room. "It's the only thing he left me." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And it's worth more than this entire fraudulent empire." Then I turned my back on her and walked out of the room. Victory didn't feel like the triumphant fanfare I had imagined. It felt like silence. An echoing, hollow silence that settled deep in my bones, leaving behind an exhaustion that went beyond physical or mental fatigue. It was a soul-deep weariness. The fallout from the boardroom confrontation was handled with the swift, quiet efficiency of corporate damage control. Serafina's downfall wasn't a public spectacle. The board of Thorn Capital, in a desperate bid to save the company, quietly forced her resignation and settled matters behind closed doors. There were no screaming headlines, just a brief, sterile press release about a change in leadership. At the same time, the NTSB and FAA released their joint final report. I was fully exonerated. The report praised my unconventional but effective actions under extreme duress. I was cleared for active duty. My name was cleared. My wings were clean. On every front, I had won. But as I sat in my quiet apartment near Travis Air Force Base, the silence felt less like peace and more like an empty space. The war was over, but the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of my own family. I remembered something my grandmother used to quote from her worn old Bible when I was a child. "And the truth will set you free." I had clung to that idea, believing that exposing the truth was the ultimate goal. The truth was out now. But what was real freedom? Was it just the absence of conflict? The question lingered unanswered. A week later, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Serafina. She wanted to meet, not at a law office or a fancy restaurant, but at a small Greasy Spoon diner just off the highway, a few miles from the base. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of old coffee and bacon grease permanently baked into the walls. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. The woman sitting in the booth was not the Wall Street Queen I knew. The Armani suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. Her hair was pulled back without its usual perfect styling, and there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. She looked smaller, older, and profoundly tired, defeated. I slid into the booth opposite her. A waitress came by, and I ordered a black coffee. Serafina just shook her head. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then she pushed a thick manila envelope across the sticky tabletop. "It's all yours," she said, her voice a dry, hoarse rasp. "The lawyers have structured the transfer, the estate, the holdings, everything." I didn't touch the envelope. She finally looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes other than contempt or ambition. It was a sliver of something else, a weary, bitter acknowledgement. "I didn't think you could land that plane," she said softly. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt for what she had done, for the lies, for the cruelty. It was simply a statement of fact, a confession of her own miscalculation. She had bet against me, and I had proven her wrong in the most spectacular way imaginable. "I know," I replied, my voice equally quiet. And that was it. There were no tears, no recriminations, no dramatic scene of reconciliation. There was only the quiet, unvarnished truth hanging in the air between us. This was the end of our story, not with a resolution, but with an acceptance of the irreparable damage. We were two strangers who shared a history, nothing more. I left the diner and walked out into the bright California sun. As I drove away, I knew I was at a crossroads. The envelope on the passenger seat beside me represented a life of unimaginable wealth, a fortune built on the ashes of my family's lies. I could take it. I could live a life of ease, of luxury. Or I could do something else. I pulled over to the side of the road. I took out my phone, found the number from the text message, and held my thumb over the screen. This wasn't an act of hatred or revenge. It was an act of survival, an act of redrawing a boundary that should have been drawn a lifetime ago. My grandmother was right. The truth had set me free, but not in the way I expected. It hadn't freed me from Serafina or the memory of my father. It had freed me from the desperate, lifelong yearning for their approval. I finally forgave myself. I forgave myself for wanting so badly to be seen by people who were incapable of seeing me. I forgave myself for believing their definition of my worth for so long. And in that moment of forgiveness, I was truly free from the weight of the past. I looked at the envelope again. This money, this tainted legacy, wasn't a prize to be won. It wasn't mine to keep. It was a tool. And I knew exactly what I was going to build with it. I pressed the delete button. The contact vanished from my phone. The last tie was cut. I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway, heading toward my own future. I didn't keep a single dollar of the Stern estate. The money was tainted, stained with a legacy of lies and deceit that I refused to carry forward. Instead, I took that tool and I built something. Under the vast, endlessly blue skies of New Mexico, at a small municipal airport, surrounded by the stark beauty of the high desert, the Sternlight Aviation Academy was born. I poured all of it, the money, the pain, the lessons learned, into its foundation. This wasn't just a flight school, it was a sanctuary, a place for young women from difficult backgrounds, girls who had been told their whole lives in 1,000 different ways that the sky was not for them. This was my revenge. Not the fiery destruction of an enemy, but the quiet, steady act of creation. It was the best revenge of all. I was no longer a combat pilot, fighting against external threats. I became a teacher, a mentor, a guide. The profound peace I had been searching for wasn't found in the silent solitude between the clouds. I found it right here, on the solid ground of this sun-baked runway, watching the look of pure, unadulterated joy on a student's face as her wheels left the earth for the first time. I found it in the shared sense of accomplishment, in the small victories, in the futures I was helping to launch. One sweltering afternoon, there was a hesitant knock on my office door. A young woman stood in the doorway, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. She was about 16, with a familiar set of determined eyes that immediately sent a jolt through my system. It was Lyra, Serafina's daughter, my niece. She had come all the way here by bus alone. She wasn't here because of her family name, or because she expected any special treatment. In fact, she seemed terrified that I might think that. I'd like to apply, Captain, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but her gaze was firm, unwavering. I want to take the entrance exam. I want to earn my own wings. I looked at her, and I didn't see the shadow of her mother. I didn't see the painful history of the Stern family. I saw the same fire that had burned in me when I was her age, the same hunger for the sky, the same desperate need to prove her own worth on her own terms. In that moment, I knew the cycle was broken. The bitter loop of resentment, of comparison, of transactional love that had defined my family for generations had finally come to an end with her. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "Welcome to Sternlight, Lyra," I said. I wasn't welcoming a niece. I wasn't welcoming a Thorn or a Stern. I was welcoming a future pilot. As the sun began to dip below the distant mesas, casting long shadows across the runway, I stood by the fence, my hands in my pockets. A pair of our small training planes, Cessna 102s, were practicing touch and goes, their engines a gentle drone in the warm, still air. They circled gracefully against the canvas of the spectacular New Mexico sunset, a sky painted in impossible shades of orange, pink, and deep violet. I used to think the sweetest revenge would be the roar of a jet engine, a display of overwhelming power, but I was wrong. The sweetest revenge is this quiet, this profound, unshakable peace. I once believed that strength was about fighting and winning, about asserting dominance, about proving everyone wrong. I understand now that true strength is freedom. It's the freedom from the past, the freedom from the judgment of others, and most importantly, the freedom to define your own value. My victory wasn't in shouting louder than my sister or in bringing down her empire. My victory was in learning how to fly higher than all of it. And from up here, from this place of peace and purpose, I can see the world differently. My job is no longer to carry soldiers or cargo. My job is to plant seeds of hope on the ground below, to watch them take root and grow toward the sun. That is my legacy, not one I inherited, but one I built with my own 2 hands. My story, the one you've just heard, found its ending not in a fight, but in building something new. I believe we all have a legacy, not the one we're given, but the one we choose to create, piece by piece, day by day. It's built from the moments we choose strength over bitterness and purpose over pain. So I'll leave you with this question. What is the legacy you are building right now? If you believe in the power of stories like this, tales of resilience and second chances, I invite you to follow our channel. There are many more journeys waiting to be shared.